everyone. I'll try to keep it to 15 minutes or less. So thanks for introducing my title. I'll jump right in, but I'll start with a caveat that this is not a story that I'm going to share in particular. I've noticed a lot of the other panelists have shared particular projects or particular stories, but this is more of a theoretical approach and a reflection on interdisciplinary collaboration between myself and Thomas Couvin. So he's not presenting today, but I'm presenting on behalf of both of us because it's our shared work. So the thing that kind of inspired the two of us to collaborate was this idea that histories of events can be told from multiple perspectives, and there's rarely just one linear narrative or single interpretation of the past. So that was kind of both something we agreed on, and we decided to combine our expertise in an interdisciplinary way to collaborate on a paper that we've written. So my area of expertise is transmedia storytelling in media studies with a focus on heritage and history. And he's a public historian himself with an interest in transmedia and alternative methods of storytelling. So what we did was combine our theoretical backgrounds as well as our practical awareness to reflect on the current theory and practice and kind of develop ways about how future narrative creation can happen in this interdisciplinary space. We decided to focus this collaboration on narratives that we call conflicting narratives, particularly on historical events, because based on Thomas' experience, this is a major area in public history where it could really benefit from using a transmedia approach. So here's just a bulleted list of a couple of themes or types of stories we think would work well with this kind of approach. So for example, if we look at any kind of story related to colonialism, there's sometimes quite two clear different sides of the story or multiple different sides of one story. Other topics we think that would fall onto these conflicting narratives would be things like segregation and discrimination of certain groups, like migrants or immigrants. I was working in the last year and a half on this idea of a European identity. So that one has a lot of storytelling and different perspectives on that concept in general, as well as other ones like cultural wars and political unrest. So we think these are kind of some ripe themes for this kind of approach. So just briefly, I'm sure many people in this audience are aware of what transmedia storytelling is, but just in case you hadn't heard of it before, transmedia storytelling, very simply put, is one story delivered across multiple different media. And the idea is that I like to describe it like a jigsaw puzzle because each piece of the transmedia story put together makes a more satisfying, holistic experience of the whole narrative. So this goes against the idea of an adaptation. So for example, if you watch a book and it's adapted into a movie, sometimes people who watch the movie are less impressed because the book had a lot more detail or side plots. So the idea of transmedia storytelling is it's intentional, strategic, and it's meant to give added value to the overall story. So as I mentioned, transmedia, some people are probably most familiar with the big fictional franchises like Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones and The Matrix. Here's one of Pokemon with Pokemon Go. These are all examples of transmedia. So it's one story world with multiple different media being used to tell that story. If we look at the heritage sector in history and the types of media they're using, they're starting to branch into transmedia use for their storytelling. So as some of you probably have experienced yourself or also studying heritage, there's many different types of media being used within museums, like audio guides are one of the first ones, but now we have these interactive digital displays and a more focus on engaging and immersing visitors in the digital experience. So when we think about that, and in terms of museums and public history, some constructions of heritage have been criticized of being overly selective or excluding many types of social groups. So that presents one of our challenges that we discuss in our paper. Then if we look at transmedia outside of museums, we also have a lot of heritage projects that are doing location-based content delivery. A lot of this is seen in cultural heritage trail mobile apps where you go along a trail and you get content delivered via your phone. It can be augmented reality or other types of media like an audio guide and these kinds of things. So there's a lot of examples out there, and they're not all mobile apps. They can also have this transmedial approach where they have, like a physical passport where when you go along a trail, you've got a stamp for visiting those, and other types of media incorporated into their overall project. So if we look at this idea of sharing authority when we're kind of combining history and storytelling and the public, I'm taking this from Kovan's paper in 2017. So this was his kind of area. So I'm summarizing his work, but he describes shared authority as the democratization of knowledge building process, so that he argues today's audiences aren't passively consuming knowledge produced by the expert historians. Now that we have digital media and people are using it to kind of record, display, and represent their version of the past or what their interpretations are, historians now have to consider this user-generated content in their practice, and particularly in public history. So the challenge with this is that there's this challenge of control. So again, this is Thomas' work where he talks about strong control versus radical trust. So when we work with members of the public, cultural institutions have traditionally developed this strong control over historical narratives because they were kind of the authoritative body. Their intention was to communicate and educate citizens. So it was naturally a top-down approach, which is why it's still prevalent, but definitely making moves to the other direction of incorporating history making process. Then on the other side of strong control, we have radical trust. So it's not necessarily something brand new. And this lets the narrator tell their story. And in the context of history, normally it's an interviewer asking their side of the story. So it gives little interference and little, his perspective, little contrast in the public. So when we talk about this challenge of control in history, then we apply that to transmedia. It also creates a design challenge of how to actually incorporate that into a narrative that's across media or even in one digital interface. And this is a quote from our paper as well, Loughborough says, sharing too little authority means that the audience will lose interest because they're unable to follow the narrative, and it privileges the curator, the museum curator or the historian or the expert's point of view. And sharing too much authority, on the other hand, means that the audience will already know that, and they won't actually get any new dimensions or new knowledge from the story or the topic at hand. So in the context of transmedia, these more participatory narratives are being co-developed using digital media, and this control over the narrative itself, because in narrative construction as well, if you give people too much freedom as an audience, especially with digital media that they might not be familiar with, then they can have issues of being lost in the narrative, especially with branching narratives. One of the presenters talked about experimenting with Twine as an example of a software that allows you to kind of create a choose your own adventure. So if you give members of the public too many narrative options, the story becomes disjointed and they kind of lacked the red thread that ties it all together. So there has to be some narrative control on behalf of the creator so that the public actually gets a narrative out of the experience. So we briefly covered some methods of co-production that are combining digital narratives and public history together. So again, most of you might be familiar with these, but I'll just touch on them as this idea of control and how that can be balanced. So one area that's quite common in digital humanities particularly is this idea of civic labor. So the idea here is that members of the public are asked to participate in a task related to history. Okay, cool. 5-minute warning, is it? And then participation is voluntary and unpaid. And the reward for their experience of participating is the intrinsic value of being involved in the process. And they're probably learning about the history as they go through. So a brief example of this is a project in Ireland, the Letters of 1916, which civil war, so it was a conflicting narrative about conflicts. And what they did was ask people to help translate handwritten letters so that they could have an actual digital machine readable copy of the letter and create a new archive. So they had volunteers contribute to this, and this would be kind of the civic labor. The participant didn't have much control of contributing to the narrative, but their work was very valuable, and it helped uncover more of the history because it allows us to look at that history using digital technologies. Another example often used, and I would probably say is the most popular currently in public history, is the crowdsourcing of historical documents and photos, as well as material artifacts from the public, as well as their oral histories. This is particularly for marginalized groups or, more grassroots level of history. And this is opening up a lot of debates on narratives that are about conflicts or have conflicting sides of the story. So people in positions of authority might have a very different interpretation of an event versus members of the public. So this was done at the University of Luxembourg, for example, where they set up this temporary space. You can see there is a history lab, and members of the public could come and bring their objects, do an oral interview, and contribute their history to the project. And then the third and final one is co-authorship. So this one allows the most shared authority between the experts of history and also the citizens. So I think actually a couple of people at this conference already have talked about these kind of citizen creative workshops. There's been a couple of different names used to describe these kinds of workshops. And another aspect of that is these citizens could create content, or, if they're already generating historical material on social media, this could be incorporated into digital displays in museums or on site at heritage sites, or on a billboard in public. And in this case, the co-authorship allows the ownership to remain with whoever's contributing. So from the expert side or the public side, they get to choose what they include, and it's kind of a shared responsibility of what the narrative comes out in the end. So final slide, wrapping up, looking at ways forward, rethinking public history narratives and their approach. So from our perspective, while historians realize that the past can't be unbiased, in the tradition of the discipline generally has been a striving for impartial resources and checking accuracy. They kind of aimed for objectivity. But now if we rephrase this towards a more public approach to history, considering public memory not something that can't be fact checked, but actually considering it as part of the history and part of the story. We are arguing that co-creation can actually allow for these competing voices or clash of perspectives to exist. And we think that this could be represented in a digital narrative with plurality, or these polyvocals. So allowing for the conflict to happen in the narrative for the participation of the public, and allowing these multiple interpretations to coexist across the different media. So this could look very different depending on the project. For example, in interactive documentaries, you might have one digital interface that visually has two sides of a story presented side by side, so someone can see the different perspectives. Or one type of narrative could be delivered as a website, and another one could be delivered in a novel or a book, or a different type of media format, an app that makes sense for the type of story being told. So we think there's a lot of potential for these two areas to collaborate in the future and really tackle these kind of competing voices or sides of the story. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So as I said before, we'll go to our next speaker, and then we'll have all our questions at the end. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Some of you, this is your future if you don't get it. So Amanda Hill is our next presenter, and her paper is Shared Authority in Digital Storytelling.
Thank you so much. So yes, Nicole definitely goes quite well with yours. So I'm Amanda Hill. I'm at the St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas, in the United States. And today we'll be talking about shared authority in digital storytelling. So the idea of shared authority was created by historian Michael Frisch. It's as an idea almost 30 years old now, and suggests that historians don't have exclusive rights to the past, but should instead seek to elaborate on history, especially in public settings such as museums and library exhibits. These are created then in dialogue with the public, with their perceptions and experiences present rather than solely the curators. Shared authority argues that citizen participants bring diverse knowledge and experience to a collaborative partnership with academically or otherwise trained curators, and the practice of such collaboration produces more profound and illustrated byproducts that include and open up conversations across socially and culturally diverse populations. I apologize, it's only 6 in the morning here, not quite 6 in the morning here, so sorry for any misspeaking. But in this way, these methods aim to serve the communities who desire what they deem to be more authentic exhibits of their experience or their culture, and thus minimizing historical curatorial practices that have been previously based on international knowledge derived from scientific or academic traditions. Oops. Okay. So Frisch wrote that the interpretive and meaning-making process is in fact shared by definition, which is inherent in the dialogic nature of an interview and in how audiences receive and respond to exhibitions and public history interchanges in general. So rather than solely relying on the expertise of trained professionals to interpret and represent all voices of the past, the input of local community members broadens and strengthens any interpretation of the past. I believe that the same theory is easily applied and should be applied to the digital storytelling programs that we do. Successful digital storytelling aims for a dialogue between expertise and experience. That is that dialogic connection between the facilitator and the storyteller, and also those other storytellers in the room. Shared authority isn't a gift that facilitators are going to bestow on storytellers. Rather, it's a recognition that stories are built collaboratively, and that the authority to interpret a scenario or context or narrative is held equally by everyone. Viewing personal narratives as co-created in this way, we call into question the authenticity of personal narratives like digital storytelling, an authenticity which previous scholarship has claimed based on the reliance of digital storytelling on the author's own words, voice, personal archives, and personal experiences. That's not to say that authenticity is completely goes away, but that instead we need to open it up to a space where to say and acknowledge that it is created within this social context. So there is no such thing as this individual story. Rather, personal narratives are constantly compounded by the agendas, experiences, and expectations of others. That's in everyday life when we tell personal stories, and certainly in the digital storytelling workshop space. So digital storytelling thus becomes this co-creative media compounded by such agendas. The collaborative efforts to produce digital storytelling within those workshops is not simply because of technology, as Spurgeon reminds us. Instead, it's that this media is facilitated by both people and organizations. So participatory media is a public social production. Moreover, while we acknowledge that participatory media is predicated on the relationship between stakeholders and the agents involved in the creation process, the rhetorical and dialogic practices among these constituents reinforces the need for an understanding of shared authority within the digital storytelling experience. In creating responsible digital storytelling practices, facilitators have to assess and understand the roles and power structures within the relationships among the people in the room and with those beyond the creative space, such as the institutions they're working with and any audience members. So it's important to look at the benefits a facilitator brings to the digital storytelling environment, especially that of expertise, which grows out of embodied action, formed through our own experience as facilitators and using that domain-specific knowledge. Knowledge that's needed for expertise is often rooted in education. And so it's one of the central socializing agencies in the world and provides that cultural knowledge about what it means to participate in this particular way. So digital storytelling workshops can provide an educational instruction in storytelling and digital literacy skills so that participants can practice such story making skills and increase their experience. But we have to understand also that the facilitators are coming in likely having trained in this or been working in these fields for many years. So it can create a hierarchy within the storytelling space to look at how narratives are created and to say that the facilitator then has more experience than the person, it's the storyteller. So facilitators typically come in with a professional function that places them in a position of other in relation to many storytelling participants. And that compounds the fact that the facilitator has that markedly different historical institutional cultural background from the participants. Facilitators are often the ones who lead or appear to lead that narrative producing process. And they're typically seen as those experts in story development or narrative production, as well as maybe in the tools and technologies that storytellers are using within the space. I like this quote from Will McCarthy, who writes that what counts as professional expertise and development is not primarily found on in-depth geographic knowledge about other places or people, but it's located in that technical know-how. I think what I like about this is that it opens up the understanding of expertise is not just one thing, and your experience in one way will not just create expertise across the board. So professional expertise lends itself to viewing the person in charge as above participants, but digital storytellers and their facilitators are not above participants, and that's where that shared authority piece comes in. While digital storytelling facilitators are knowledgeable about the process of digital story in that technical know-how kind of way, they are experts in that sense, but professional expertise, they're not neutral ideas. And the notion of that expert in the room creates that power structure between facilitators and the storytellers. So it is important that we recognize those hierarchical relationships that can form between the facilitator as expert and storytellers who might be, in the worst cases, seen as amateur in those ways, right? And to counter that approach with a view of shared authority in a way that acknowledges and values the expertise of the storytellers themselves, even if those are not the same as the facilitator. In fact, that's the best kind when you are sharing those different expertise. By adopting that practice of shared authority, we remind everyone in the room that facilitators hold expertise in some areas, but not all, and recognize that the storytellers hold their own expertise and experience, which are both equally valuable to that digital storytelling process. So generally, the broader structuring of the digital storytelling methodologies invites the oversight and strategy of those in those positions of facilitators. By strategically structuring the workshop around the goals of expanding participation, the narratives produced in the workshop can be resources for their storytellers to captivate audiences' attention. And then if we understand that resource as something that produces a benefit, digital storytelling has the capacity to teach storytellers how to tell their stories and how to use those stories to reach wider audiences. Imparting social value on narrative necessarily involves reaching an audience. And Rappaport suggests that this is the power to create, select, and tell stories, and that's the resource to itself. Narratives as resources is a useful framework to help storytellers understand the power of story, but we also need to understand that what's missing in this is the idea that audiences are going to be listening. So stories we know are distributed unevenly. Everybody has the power to create, select, and tell stories, and we do every day, but those aren't listened to equally across the board because of specific access. So facilitators are often in a place to support that heightened dissemination practice. And that's another way in which the shared authority of the storyteller and the facilitator work together to promote the value of the storyteller and their story. So in this case, sharing authority is more than merely gathering digital stories. It can also mean working with institutions and funding agents who also have their own agendas to provide access to those stories online or offline in ways that ensure the stories are truly reflective of those storytellers, their lived experience, and the communities of which they are a part. So the framework of narrative as a resource must be compounded by the idea of audience, attention, visibility, and spaces of exchange. So the relationship of storytellers a storyteller encounters with co-productive storytelling environment. They're complex, even when they're unconscious, and they inform the creation of every digital story. In order that we understand it, we must look at the fact that a personal story created in a collaborative space is not completely personal. It's created in social networks, and it's constantly in struggle with the agendas, experiences, and expectations of others. And the responsible digital storytelling facilitator will effectively manage those networks in ways that minimize that outside interference and allow the storytellers to really take authority, to take ownership over that production and dissemination of their narratives. And for those reasons, I believe we need to think about how we work to share authority within our digital storytelling practices. Thank you.
You got a really nice applause, but we were muted. Can you just clap it up? Okay, our next presenter is in person. So we have Leah Henrickson. Here she comes. And her paper is Your Differentiating Strength, Applied Digital Storytelling for Employment Interview Preparation.
It's a lot more fun than it sounds, I promise. All right, I do have a script. I'm not going to use it. The reason I have the script here is if I panic midway because this is my first live presentation in a really long time, or if you want to talk further and you want references because I have no idea who I'm citing anymore. This has been a long time coming, this project. If there's any issues online as well, I'll keep my eye on the chat and just, if you can't hear me, please let me know. But I speak loudly, so it shouldn't be a problem. So my name is Leah Henrickson. I am a lecturer in digital media at the University of Leeds, which is about 2 hours north of here. If you want to see my slides or you want to get in touch later on, my Twitter account is here. I'm quite active on Twitter, and I'm one of the few people at this conference who's kind of tweeting. My slides have been tweeted, so you can find them there, or just send me an email at l.r.henrickson@leeds.ac.uk. So today, I'm going to be talking about commercialization of digital storytelling. I'm going to be talking about my own experiences as a consultant for a business that's been trying to use digital storytelling methodologies. It's going to look a lot different than a lot of the other talks you've seen in the past few days, but you'll notice that some of the methodologies are very much the same. And I'm hoping that I can get you thinking about how we can expand our digital storytelling practice, take it out of classrooms, take it out of community settings. Not like that's not important, but also apply it to commercial spaces and look for connections in kind of the self-branding movement and the marketing movements that are happening. So the question that our research group aimed to tackle was this one here. Think about going to a job interview or any other kind of interview that you're credentials are being questioned. And this is a really common question. Tell us about a time that you demonstrated leadership, teamwork, communication, various soft skills, skills that transcend every single job. It doesn't matter what job you're going for, you want somebody who kind of knows how to work with people, that kind of thing, right? But this is my reaction. I'm pretty confident. I've come up here, I'm like, I know what I bring to the table. And this question still stumps me. And it certainly stumps the young graduates, the college students. So for those outside of the UK, that's age 16 to 18, those 16 to kind of 22-year-olds who've maybe never had jobs before, who don't necessarily feel so confident or even just aware of what they bring to the table. I think we're all pretty familiar with this feeling that we get. So tell us about a time that you demonstrated soft skill. And that's really what we started realizing was a problem, is we couldn't answer the question for ourselves. So how do we expect our young graduates to be able to answer that question? This is a quotation that kind of got us going. This is Amy Eubanks Davis, and Davis runs a charity in Chicago called Braven, which aims to get low income and underrepresented young people into universities and into careers. So getting them confident in what they bring to the table, very much doing what we are trying to do, but more on a kind of one-to-one basis. And we wanted to take what Amy Eubanks Davis was doing and turn it into kind of a product that we could market. And I don't mean to kind of make this sound crass. We are doing a social good. We know we're doing a social good, but we were funded by a startup funder and we needed to make some kind of money off of this. So this is a TED Talk, a very short TED Talk that Davis gives about the power of your story and how your unique story can get you hired. And in the talk, she says, what I've realized is that these experiences that seem like a liability are actually your differentiating strength. The secret is to transform how you perceive your own story. And she then compares storytelling to running a marathon. So your story can help you build confidence, but it takes practice to get to that point and to kind of feel comfortable running that long distance, taking on that challenge. And she says that your story can help you get there. We want to help our young graduates get there. So what I'm presenting today has been turned into a paper. It is available. It was recently published, I believe something like last month or 2 months ago. And what I'm presenting is a really kind of condensed version of what is in this paper. I use the same methodological framework, but if you are looking to benefit from this research in this way, you can find the paper in Convergence. And this is the title. And my co-authors, William Jeffcoat and Reese Commichon, not academics. So William is a designer, a UX designer for a ship company, and Reese is an engineer for Jaguar Land Rover. So we are coming at this from very different perspectives. We're just three pals having a nice time. But the different perspectives you will absolutely see. If you want to know more about the challenges we came up, we also self-published a little bulletin about achieving success in an interdisciplinary team. It's freely available online, and you'll hear us all kind of whinge about each other, but in a nice way. You can learn from our mistakes through there as well. So just a heads up. So I'm surprised throughout this conference, I thought this would be referenced a lot more. I've not seen anyone reference this, so I'm going to quickly run through it. I was going to blast through it, but this is Joe Lambert's 7 steps of classical digital storytelling. Classical digital storytelling being that kind of thing that we're seeing a lot of, that almost like PowerPoint with a voiceover. And that's what Joe Lambert outlines in his book, his kind of formative book about classical digital storytelling. And what I've done on this slide is I've highlighted the 7 steps, and I've used some of the questions that I came in when I was brought in as an academic consultant for this company that I'll introduce in a second. These are the questions that I brought in to the room, to the executive room, and I was like, these are the questions you need to be asking. So I'm not going to go through all of those questions in depth, but they are there so they can get a feel for what kinds of things I was asking Will and Reese and the number of other people who were in the room. So we want to make sure that the users of our app, to be introduced, own their insights. So what stories do they want to tell? Why is that story important? And why is that story important right now? That sense of urgency. We want them to own their emotions. So all of the emotions they feel while they tell their story, when their story was taking place, How did that make them feel? We want them to find the moment of change. So when did things change? What was that moment of transformation? When did you actually realize, oh, I've learned something? We want them to see the story. So we want them to make something that they can then reflect back on and look at and be like, oh, that's my story. Or if they want to, they can change it. We want them to hear their story, so hear their own voices in the story. We want them to assemble their story. So again, that iterative process of making that story, something we're all very familiar with, even if we're just using that kind of video technology. Quite simple, but really effective. And then we want them to share their story. It's all well and good that they build the confidence in themselves, but when you go to a job interview or when you're crafting a job application, we want to make sure that they are able to communicate those moments of transformation to someone who isn't them, to someone who's employing them, to high stakes contexts. So those are the questions. This is the business. So I'm going to urge you not to go to this website, but if you're really keen, this is available online. The reason I ask is because we are still just in the final stages of releasing the first version of this product, and the website is live. I don't know why. But whatever. So this is WIDO. WIDO stands for Whale in the Ocean. It stems from a story of Mohammed, our friends Mohammed and Reese, sitting in a library. And Reese was there wanting to kind of build a startup, figuring out what he wants, what problems he wants to solve. And Mohammed goes, well, what do you want? Do you want to be a small fish in a big pond, or do you want to be a big fish in a small pond? And Reese looks at Mohammed. And if you know Reese, I'm assuming none of you know Reese, but my friend Reese, very on brand, answers, I don't want to be any of those options. I want to be a whale in the ocean. And that's where this comes from, that story. So we want all of our kind of users to feel like they're whales in the ocean, that they have all this stuff to offer and that they can go into those oceans and thrive. So we're all about soft skills, identifying soft skills, reinforcing the importance of soft skills, and then getting our users hired. This is the WIDO app. It has gone through numerous iterations. We've gone through things like chatbots. We've gone through apps. We use Discord. We've done so many versions of this app, and this is kind of what we've settled on for the beta, the first release. So you'll notice here, it's all a scrapbook form. So in the bottom kind of corner here, you'll see this scrapbook. The Zoom is blocking it a little bit, but you click on which skill you would like to tell a story about. It brings you to a mood board in the top left corner. So we give you some prompts, some ways to think about that skill. We give you a definition, fun GIFs, maybe some videos. Now it's time to reflect on your experiences. We ask them some 3 questions. So recall a moment when you demonstrated this skill. What did you do? What happened? And that's that. And then finally, we have another screen. In 1 sentence, what did you learn from this experience? So that iterative process of storytelling. It then turns it into a really cheesy motivational picture. So in the version here, you can only do a kind of mountainscape, but in the final version, what we're doing is we're allowing customization and imagery, and then it puts it in your scrapbook, and then you're able to view it at a later time, and you can change it if you want to. So it's a really quite simple version of storytelling, and right now it's only textual, but this, based on our overly extensive user testing, actually seems to really work and get people thinking critically about their stories. And these are the questions that when we were evaluating WIDO's effectiveness, these are what we were asking ourselves. So what are the correct questions to ask WIDO users to prompt them to think of and write a good, so critically self-reflective and comprehensible story? How might WIDO help users identify key moments in their lives to provide evidence of soft skills? And where is WIDO's meeting point between the storyteller, the user, and the listener, the employer? And you'll notice the employer is missing from here. So just based on the framework, these are some of our core findings. I won't go through them in great depth, but what I will say is that this is a really effective way of getting people to find the moments in their lives. Every single participant in this iteration was able to identify a moment of change, was able to assemble a story that was critically self-reflective, and we had a measure of how we evaluated that. They were understandable. There were some interesting findings though. So some of the things that we struggled with, these are a bunch of 18-year-olds who, most of whom have never had jobs before, who are drawing about stories about dying loved ones and having a pet and going to football games. And these are the stories that they're drawing on. And something that we struggled with was getting them to think about the personal and professional divide, because they have this idea of what is professional and what is personal, and are deeply kind of uncomfortable with stepping over the kind of personal professional line. And they're not able to see how the two blend together. So that's something we needed to overcome. Another kind of interesting finding was that we actually had to remove, for a long time, we had to remove use of the word story. Because again, we're talking to a bunch of 18-year-old male gamers, for example, and the word story to them means children's book. So the word story immediately alienated our intended audience. And we had to then ease our way back into using the word story. And we very rarely use the word story at WeDo now for that reason. So things like that, really unexpected things. We're not preaching to the choir here. We're trying to get people to think of stories without kind of making them realize the storytelling exercise. So you can get a feel for what we did. Again, the paper's there if you want to know more, but I will just say it's quite effective. The next steps for us is to do sharing your story. So you'll notice that the employer really isn't there. And we were trying to figure out how we could share these stories, not just in an interview context, but also as part of the job application. So right now we're in the process of interviewing a hell of a lot of recruiters, getting them to tell us kind of what they think of the WeDo product, what they're looking for as they're trying to evaluate candidates. And we've started doing this digital business card where you can share your story. This is a very, very early prototype of it. But basically you have a WeDo profile and you're able to curate stories based on particular jobs. So all of a sudden we're humanizing that, that job application process. Problem is no one has the time to read these stories. So we're trying to figure out how we can kind of get things across in a short and snappy way. But this is what we're doing. I think I only have a few more slides left. Yeah, so at the end of the day, this product, I mean, it's not going to make any money. We've kind of abandoned any kind of hope of actual commercialization. So it's just going to be released as a way of getting students to self-reflect, probably. My second-year undergraduate digital storytelling students, they'll probably benefit from this. And we'll just be kind of giving it out for free anyway. But at the end of the day, we have found this to be a really effective way to get people self-reflecting, empowering themselves and realizing what kinds of skills they already have, even if they've never had formal employment or they're just not confident in their abilities, and getting them to use their stories in other spaces. So practicing storytelling so that they can then tell those stories later when the stakes are higher. And this is just to end. This is us looking like we're a 90s emo band. So this is myself, this is William, our designer, and this is Reese, our engineer. Thank you so much for your time. If you do have any questions, by all means, get in touch. And I look forward to hearing from you. I left my coffee over here.
Yeah. No, it should be a case of.
Oh, right, she's doing the, okay.
Jenny, did you want to introduce this at all, or say anything before, or do you just want us to say?
I think it's probably self-explanatory, so everything should be in there. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next presenter is Jenny O'Connor, and her topic is Rethinking Research Theater Practice and Research Dissemination through Digital Storytelling. And she's actually prepared her presentation as a video. So we'll show that in just a sec.
Hi, and welcome to my paper, Rethinking Research, Theatre Practice and Research Dissemination through Digital Storytelling. The playwright Teresa Deevy was born in Waterford in the southeast of Ireland in 1894. She became deaf in her early 20s as a result of contracting Meniere's disease, but went on to become a successful author and playwright, writing plays that were performed at Ireland's National Abbey Theatre, as well as dramas for radio and even a ballet, Possession, which was written around 1930 but which has never been performed. My colleagues in English and Theatre Studies at South East Technological University, Drs Una Keeley and Kate McCarthy, have written extensively on Teresa Deavy's life and work, and they first engaged with the internationally renowned performance artist Amanda Coogan and Dublin Theatre of the Deaf when Keeley and McCarthy wrote about their interpretation of Teresa Deavy's play The King of Spain's Daughter from 1935, which was entitled Talk Real Fine, Just Like a Lady. Coogan is a hearing child of deaf adults whose relationship with Albion Jones and the Anne Quigley of Dublin Theatre of the Deaf resulted in a production that explored, as Keeley and McCarthy put it, the ways that lexical systems, both vocal and signed, can silence women. The consideration of the gendered nature of Irish Sign Language was an important element of this exploration, given that the production aimed to reintroduce women's sign into many of the lyrical movements of bodies on stage. While ISL was recently recognised as an official language of the Irish state, the syntax, grammar and lexicon of the language developed differently in two Dublin schools during the 1800s, one male, one female. In the resultant and informal amalgamation of the two forms of the language that occurred thereafter, the erasure of women's sign doubled the oppression of deaf women who were otherwise subjugated by virtue of their gender by the Irish state, something that is made visible in the theatre work of Teresa Deavy more generally. In their book chapter on Talk Real Fine, Just Like a Lady, Keeley and McCarthy note that Coogan adds contemporary resonances to a text from 1935, retaining and expanding the lyricism and spirit of feminist activism that characterised Deavy's play to create dynamic and multi-resonant layers of meaning within the resulting theatrical text. This is relevant in considering the context in which the current workshopping of Deavy's only ballet, Possession, is at once an awakening of a never-before-performed text that is rooted in ancient Irish myth called the Táin Bó Cúailnge, or the cattle raid of Cooley, and a contemporary discourse on the impact of disciplinary power on the lives of deaf women throughout Ireland's history. The workshopping of this ballet serves as the basis of the Lyrical Bodies research project, which aims to consider issues of ableism and gender discrimination through theatre practice. The translation of the Táin by Ciarán Carson tells the tale of the events that follow a post-coital argument between the Queen of Connacht, Maeve, and her husband Ailill over who has the greatest wealth. Ailill's magical white-horned bull proves the deciding factor, and Maeve's desire to level the playing field by acquiring the brown bull of Cooley from Ulster results in the tragic events of the story. She tries bribery and finally resorts to taking the animal by force in a secret raid. The famous character Cuchulainn is the only survivor, and when Ailill and Maeve return to Connacht with the brown bull, it kills the white-horned bull and then dies itself from its battle wounds. Deavy's version of the story derives from Eleanor Hull's publication of the tale from 1898, comprises only 3 pages, and leaves a great deal of space for interpretation, such as the description of Maeve's movement as a dance expressive of admiration, love, and the introduction of spirits of pity and tenderness, spreading their draped arms as sheltering wings at the end of the ballet. Through focusing on the tragedy of Maeve, Deavy favours the female story above that of her husband and of Cuchulainn, as does a more recent version of the tale by Karina Tynan from 2020, and simultaneously speaks to the historical context of partition within the island of Ireland. The performance of the ballet will also seek to consider the silencing of deaf women within patriarchal constructs from the 1800s on, when the hemorrhaging of women's sign through the prioritisation of the male lexicon of ISL was rendered visible. The discussion of these layerings of historical context and socio-political commentary, as well as the impact of dramaturgical and performance decisions, will be disseminated through traditional means via academic articles as befits the demands of a third-level university, something that de Jager et al. 2017 acknowledge as inevitable in their systematic review of digital storytelling and research. However, as Davey and Benjaminson 2021 observe in relation to ethnographic research, there are some circumstances in which the rich insights, realities and nuances of field experiences can often be challenging for researchers to translate into academic articles. As de Jager et al. 2017 note, digital stories have a great potential for knowledge translation, considering they are a ready-made KT product. However, the approach to digital storytelling differs from the established format that emerged from Story Centre in the 80s and 90s here. While that model relies on personal stories that are generated by the participants themselves in a group setting and are guided by feedback from other participants and a trained facilitator, the plan for the digital storytelling output of this project is to employ ArcGIS story mapping software to scaffold my telling of a number of stories that are likely to emerge during the course of the project. For example, the plot of Deavy's Possession and the contemporary residences it contains, the story of the growth of the research project, the importance of women's sign to the production, etc. As a result, it is vital to be cognizant of the foregrounding of my own voice in these stories and to consider whether this conflicts with the project's aims of respect and inclusion. Gubrium et al. 2014a acknowledged the complexities around issues of voice in traditional digital storytelling methods, but endorse what they call the strategically authentic voice, one whose objective is to create social change. In addition, they invoke the polyvocal quality of Bakhtin's The Dialogic Imagination, which recognises the intersubjectivity and intertextuality of all of the agents involved in the creation of the story. In the case of lyrical bodies, the stories created will be comprised of multiple languages: speech, Irish Sign Language, visual systems of communication, including editing, and sound design, and as a result will be influenced by the many different voices involved in the project. Austin and Wawera 2018 note the importance of creating an epistemological framework in relation to digital stories in order to predefine the nature of the discourse, narratives, and relationships to experiences as social constructs. Here, however, while we can articulate the polyvocal ethos behind the stories created and can consider how best to represent the experiences of researchers, participants, and collaborators, it is not possible to foresee the surprising ways in which the workshops interpret and reinterpret the text, and the ways in which the participants engage with and react to the collaborative tasks. This is one of the challenges that must be addressed in relation to digital storytelling in this context. But the implementation of such an epistemological framework enables the research team to consider other possible challenges to the ethical and practical creation of digital stories as tools for research dissemination, as well as creative artefacts in their own right. It is common for the recording of work in practice-based research to take place so that researchers can review the progress of the project and can mitigate against any tendency towards a biased recollection of what took place. In this case, digital storytelling takes this practice one step further. In a previous story mapping project that I undertook in 2021, I used direct interviews with a single participant in order to inspire a range of stories that were rooted in a small geographical area, Waterford City and the nearby seaside village of Dunmore East. In this case, it was the story of a Waterford author who was also the grandmother of a neighbour of mine, and so the stories used the traditional photo and video-based visual backdrop and a central narration in each case. The aim here is to use the same ArcGIS story mapping software to house a series of stories on a central website that can then be disseminated to the general public as well as to DV scholars, and which mixes an academic focus with personal reflection within the geographical context of DV's home city of Waterford to articulate the experimental nature of this practice-based research project. However, due to the separate ethical and GDPR or data protection process that is required of interview-based projects, and the necessity of this project to gain ethical approval within a given time frame, these digital stories will rely on the recording of moments of reflection by participants rather than formal interviews. This is what Sean refers to as reflection in action. The Lyrical Bodies project is rolling out over 3 phases. Phase 1 took place in February 2022, Phase 2 in April and June, and Phase 3 will be the write-up and dissemination phase, taking place over the coming years up to 2027. This final phase will involve the digital story creation as well as conference papers and publications on the analysis of the workshopping phase and on the final performance of DV's ballet, as well as on the impact of digital storytelling in the dissemination of the project and research findings. As mentioned, Ireland has stringent GDPR guidelines that govern the way in which research can be conducted. Because many of the participants of the project are students, a range of issues had to be approved by an ethical committee at institute level before any material could be gathered and analysed. These included ensuring any participants were over the age of 18, that they completed ongoing informed consent forms for photo and video images to be recorded, and that any imbalance in relation to hierarchy due to the researcher-participant relationship would not affect any grades that would be issued as part of their BA course. The issue of consent around photo and video material is particularly relevant to the digital story component for obvious reasons. Austin et al. 2018 note that digital storytelling should only be used within well-defined parameters of consent and withdrawal, but participants may change their minds about their consent as time goes on. Built into the design of the Lyrical Bodies project is the ability to withdraw consent up to and including the final workshopping phase in June 2022, with the understanding that thereafter, digital stories may be released to a general audience and are then impossible to contain or withdraw from the public sphere. However, according to Ireland's GDPR laws, each and every time I wish to use an image in a digital story such as this one, I will need to receive consent from the participants within that particular photo or video selection. It is anticipated that this will be time-consuming and will likely affect the choice of material as a result. In terms of developing the epistemological framework then, all such challenges must be engaged with and negotiated. Gubrium et al. 2014b articulate a range of these in their consideration of digital storytelling in health research, and while the types of stories that they consider rely on personal perspective and so differ from what will be created here, the concerns articulated resonate strongly. One such issue is entitled The Power of Shaping and is concerned with the role of the storyteller and how power dynamics might alter the story told. The manipulation of audiovisual material, as well as my narration as an observer of the proceedings of the workshops, rely on subjective decision-making regarding what should be included and what should be left out, and so it is vital that the primary researchers as well as collaborators are regularly consulted during the process. This is to ensure that the general aim inherent in the documentation of practice-based theatre research, as articulated earlier, that is, to offer different perspectives on the work, align with the project aims as a whole that outline the need for awareness, inclusion and reflection in the approach to the workshopping and dissemination phases. This is also coterminous with the design of the project, which recognises that the purpose of sampling articulated by O'Leary 2004 is necessary in all types of qualitative research that, quote, involves the selection of a sample with a particular purpose in mind. Another concern is the potential expiration of any software platform such as ArcGIS, which must be mitigated against by retaining original MP4 files and housing individual stories on a private YouTube channel. Finally, these digital stories are required to fulfil a remit of accessibility, given the nature of the collaboration with Dublin Theatre of the Deaf. While a number of research articles on accessibility stress the importance of good captioning styles, Mack et al. 2020 point out the necessity to build in a consideration of sign language, in their case ASL, to social media platforms and online video content. Insistence upon accessibility is central to the work of Keeley and McCarthy and to the aims of the project that stress the importance of respect for the deaf community, whose method of communication is different to those who consume media in traditional ways. Lyrical Bodies is particularly concerned with challenging the prejudiced assumptions held by the hearing population towards deaf people and the ways in which these assumptions perpetuate systemic symbolic violence towards members of the deaf community. So what will the documentation of the project entail, and how will digital storytelling offer this accessible overview of the project, as well as disseminating the research as detailed by Keeley and McCarthy? It is important to outline the findings of phases 1 and 2 of the project up to the date of submission of this paper in order to put into context the epistemological issues outlined earlier. Before the commencement of the research, Dr. Keeley provided participants with a brief lecture on the project and some basic instruction in Irish Sign Language so that they could communicate their names to Jones and Quigley during phase 1. Coogan was absent from this stage due to illness, and the grounding in deaf culture was provided by Jones and Quigley via a translated lecture on the origins of ISL, as well as the discrimination suffered by Irish deaf people and deaf women in particular. It is significant that the workshopping phase is held in the College Street campus of South East Technological University, formerly the site of one of Waterford's Magdalen laundries, where, quote, sinful young women were often held against their will and whose narratives have been reclaimed by the work of SETU researchers such as O'Mahony 2018. Previous work by O'Mahony, McCarthy and Culleton 2021 situated site-specific performances of commemoration of survivor experiences in this location, and Jones and Quigley explored a range of tasks with participants that involved them connecting deeply with their embodied experience of place where free communication via traditional modes of speech was forbidden or restricted for those confined there. Unfortunately, ethical approval was delayed during the first workshopping phase, meaning that we cannot use any material from this first phase for the purposes of digital storytelling, but it nonetheless serves to provide a deep understanding for participants of the layering of contexts of oppression of Irish deaf women that the performance of Possession seeks to foreground. During this phase, the initial foundations of Dublin Theatre of the Deaf's approach to Deavy's texts, as informed by their collaboration, was also made evident, as Jones and Quigley explored ways of encapsulating the actions of key players in the ballet, such as Queen Maeve and the Bulls, that incorporated Deavy's directions, as well as elements of women's sign, to create scenes that were immensely powerful in their quiet recognition of moments of hubris, self-destruction and sorrow. During phase 2, Coogan's tendency to distill the essence of the text and its many layered contexts into embodied movement, costume and dance resulted in numerous images and video excerpts that will form rich sources of material from which to select audiovisual components for the digital stories. Long swathes of brightly coloured fabric symbolised the dead bodies of warriors and were carried by participants, slowly unfurling to reveal the breadth of the devastation of battle. While earlier, Maeve revels in her own wealth in an almost grotesque fashion, speaking to a modern consumerist preoccupation with material goods and the ways in which patriarchal systems of power give rise to a rot that erodes female agency and intercommunity relations. By the time this paper is shared at the International Digital Storytelling Conference in Loughborough, participants in the project will have joined Coogan in revealing this section of the interpretation of the ballet as part of Coogan's residency in the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin. Clearly, the co-creation of this important text calls out for alternative methods of documentation and dissemination, and while academic publishing holds a revered place in third-level institutes and creates barometers of success for academics, digital stories can exist within the space of action research, which, as Jameson and Holty Hang 2014 note, is often related to an understanding of experience as relevant knowledge. As the researchers go on to note, this is an approach to research that links knowledge development to social change and the involvement of those affected. While digital storytelling is a potentially rich tool for knowledge translation, it also provides a sensory method of disseminating vital research that generates what Gubrium et al. 2014a call a visceral impact, and which progresses the project's aim to challenge ableist and gender-based oppression. Many thanks for listening, and you can find references on the following slides.
Okay, just do that. Stop sharing.